Good afternoon. Sorry for the delays. We're having a few technical troubles here. Welcome to this afternoon's IT Governance is a webinar on what every IT professional needs to know about penetration test. My name is Garrett Williams. I'm a senior consultant and trainer here at IT Governance, and I look after the technical services, which includes the penetration testing team. Just before I start, a couple of housekeeping notes. Slides and recordings will be made available after the webinar. I would attempt to answer some of the questions at the end of the webinar. And if you have any further questions, please contact us. This presentation should take about 40 to 45 minutes, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. So what I'll be looking at is look at the penetration testing, but from the point of view of a client. So I'll be trying to answer some of the questions about penetration testing, looking at the difference between the different types of tests and what is the best option for you, some of the issues around the scoping of a penetration test, in particular the sort of things that your provider of penetration testing should be asking you as an organization during the scoping exercise. Looking at the various different types of testing and what needs to be tested, looking at the reports and what should be in the reports, as well as the credentials and accreditation of the penetration tester that you employ. So what I'm going to start with is actually look at what a penetration test is. And Wikipedia defines it as an attack on a computer system with the intention of finding security weaknesses. What a penetration test is about identifying vulnerabilities in your systems, in your networks, in your applications, and in your users that could be exploited by an attacker. So it identifies the vulnerabilities, identifies the attack surface area. It can also give assurance about the controls that you have in place to protect your systems and that they are working. And it tests the target of the test, the systems, applications, users, as if they were under attack from an attacker. However, there are some sort of caveats on what that's on the testing and how realistic it is. So the main differences between a penetration test and a hack are that the penetration test obviously has permission to test the systems, whereas a malicious hacker is committing an illegal act. A penetration tester is often limited in time to complete the attack on the systems, so there will be a time scale for the test in which he will try and complete the attack in. However, a malicious attacker has all the time in the world to attempt a hack and can do it very quietly in the background, trying to go under the radar and not be detected. A penetration test has to stay within legal and ethical limits, and this applies when doing sort of social engineering attacks, whereas a malicious hacker has no legal ethical restraints other than their own self-imposed ones. And also, importantly, a penetration test is actually just a snapshot in time conducted at intervals, whereas an attacker will attack at any time, and new vulnerabilities can be discovered at any moment in time, and as soon as a vulnerability has been discovered and announced, often attackers will try and beat the window of remediation and sort of get into that window of opportunity before people have remediated their systems. So a penetration test, although it sort of follows the same procedures, the same activities that an attacker would do, there are some caveats or limitations on the actual test itself. It is not the same as a proper attack by a criminal, another organization doing industrial espionage, or another country taking action. So what a penetration test is to try and gain access to your systems from outside, and it can do this by looking at the user layer, which is the easiest layer to exploit, social engineering, and it's also the hardest one to protect against. followed by looking at the vulnerabilities in the application layer. And the application layer itself is, after social engineering, the most promising avenue of attack. Applications are developed and coded by people. They make mistakes. SQL injection is still very prevalent, even though it's been 16 years since the first paper on SQL injection, and the principles of remediation for SQL injection are well known. It is still one of the most prevalent attacks on an application. And then the last one is looking at the network layer, one of the hardest ones to exploit. There are a lot of countermeasures that can be deployed that will protect the network layer. Often attacks on the network layer are more about the availability in terms of conducting denial of service, DDoS attacks on your systems. So each of these layers we have a attack surface, which is the sort of the size or the visibility of your systems at that particular layer. Obviously with users we have emails. It's very easy to get to the users. There are a lot of vulnerabilities. People will click and open on emails, follow links, go to websites. So the attack surface is sort of a function of the number of systems, the number of people at each layer, and the number of vulnerabilities. The larger the attack surface, the more visible you are, the more likely you are to actually be attacked. Penetration testing can actually identify the attack surface and actually help you reduce the size of it, reducing the likelihood that you could be attacked. And of course, we need to consider that the attack surface is not just the external of the organization, but can also be internal, the malicious user. Or, since the user attack surface goes over the sort of firewall and past the perimeter, allowing people who attack the user to get inside your perimeter. An attacker can use that vector to then attack your applications and networks from the inside. So the penetration testing is looking to gain access. The larger the attack surface, the more likely you are to be attacked, the more likely that someone is to get into your system. So being able to reduce the attack surface or get visibility of the attack surface and reduce it is an important part of penetration testing, an outcome from it. So as I've mentioned, there are internal and external views. The internal is often a malicious insider, or it could be an actions of a hacker who has gained access through another system or user to the internal network and is now attacking the internals. An example of this would be the Target breach in December that was reported, when the attackers got in through a trusted third party into Target and then were able to attack the point of sales systems from inside the network. The external sort of simulates an external threat to the actions of a hacker that trying to get access to your systems, but trying to get through your perimeter and through your controls. So these are sort of the main two starting points for a penetration test. An external penetration test looking to see what an external hacker can see of your systems, or looking to see what a malicious user can do by actually having the penetration tester inside your organization on the network, seeing what they can do. So that's what outlines the sort of the penetration test. And what we're going to look at next is what needs to be tested. So it's anything at the network layer, the application layer, and the users within the user layer. They need to be considered as part of the scope of the tests. But public accessible systems, high-risk systems with known vulnerabilities that cannot be remediated, or high-value systems where you may have credit card data or intellectual property stored, will need to be tested if you want to sort of assurance about the security of that information. And obviously there are internal systems as well as the externally visible public systems. But an important part to remember is also the segmentation between boundaries of security, zones of security, between your DMZ and the internal network, the DMZ and the internet itself. Trying to make sure that the segmentation is correctly done, and this is a requirement of the PCI DSS version 3, is that the segmentation of the cardholder data must be tested to ensure that both ingress and egress rules are in place. Often what we want to do is make sure not only can we stop people from coming in, but if somehow they get into the system, they can't extract or exfoliate the data from your networks to the outside. In the case of Target, an internal FTP server is used as part of the exfiltration process to get the data, the cardholder data, harvested from the point of sales out to the actual attackers. So we need to consider the wireless technologies as well, Wi-Fi, mobile phone, the use of phone communication systems, PBXs, voice over IP, and increasingly these days, bring your own device, BYOD, as well as physical security and social engineering. So what does a penetration test cover? Well, effectively a penetration test actually tests against known vulnerabilities and exploits. It's testing, depending upon the knowledge of the actual tester itself, they will actually have maybe a wide range of knowledge about exploits and coding. They will be able to do a very detailed test and actually see whether or not any of the potential vulnerabilities can be turned into access and retrieving information. So a penetration test will actually test against what is known by using information about known vulnerabilities and from exploits that could be in the wild, which are often code developed from proof of concepts of vulnerabilities that have been published by researchers. And often the exploits will be daisy-chained together. So a penetration test or an attacker will actually attack an intermediate weaker system that may be trusted by the final target to actually get to the target itself. So there will daisy-chain exploits together to attempt to get to the actual target itself. So the tests themselves, we have two levels of penetration testing. We have the level 1, which is a combination of automated scanning and manual scanning, as indicated on this. And compared to a plain vulnerability scan, this goes into a bit more detail. It identifies better the attack surface area, but it doesn't go on to actually see whether or not those vulnerabilities can be exploited and the target system can be reached. Whereas a layer 2 full penetration test will actually go that one step further and actually look at gaining full access to the systems, not just only identifying the vulnerabilities, but can they actually be exploited? Can you actually reach the systems? Full penetration testing using exploits. One of the problems with this is quite often you may identify a vulnerability without actually risking the actual system in terms of stability. But when you go to exploit that, you can put the stability of the system at risk. It could be destructive. So it's not best practice on production systems or systems deployed into the public where a test could actually end up doing a denial of service on your systems. So testing goes beyond the automated tools. The testing that we do includes manual scanning at the lowest level and simple testing to identify false positive results. Also, with the manual scanning and manual testing, what we're actually looking for is root causes of groups of vulnerabilities. Quite often by resolving a root cause, a number of vulnerabilities will be remediated. So it's important to actually think about what tests don't cover. A penetration test does not give absolute security. They are unlikely to find all the security issues. And this is because vulnerabilities have been discovered the whole time. The term zero-day indicates there are vulnerabilities that are not widely known to the general community. And it may not be possible to test for those if the tools or knowledge of the tester are not aware of them. So it's not 100% accurate. And also firewalls, IDS, IPS, traffic shaping, various network controls that may be out of control of the client can affect the results as well. So a test will not give you 100% security. It will not actually identify potentially all the vulnerabilities. If it comes back and says that no vulnerabilities were found, that may mean there were vulnerabilities, zero-days ones, that were not identifiable. And because of penetration testing, systems may be put at risk, may be considered destructive, detrimental to the performance of a system. Quite often, the full range of tests can't be deployed in the production situation against public-facing web applications, because you don't want to put a denial-of-service attack on your own systems. So quite often, the testing will be done against betas or on test platforms, which may not represent the production environment, and there could be vulnerabilities when introduced when a system is moved from testing and development into the production environment. And that wouldn't be picked up in any tests that are done at the sort of the acceptance stage. So in terms of vulnerabilities being there and not being discovered, Heartbeat is an example where a programmer accidentally introduced the vulnerability into the application when doing a patch, a modification. That was done 2 years ago. It wasn't discovered by ethical researchers who reported it until about the beginning of mid-March, where they actually discovered it and reported it through disclosure to OpenSSL and to other organizations. And 2 weeks after the discovery, a public announcement occurred. So those systems actually had the Heartbeat vulnerability in it for over 2 years. It wasn't to the public announcement and various scanners and exploit tools were made available that testers could gain visibility and actually say, yes, this system's now got a vulnerability. Whereas a test 2 or 3 weeks prior to that would have actually indicated the system was okay. And unfortunately, after a public announcement, there was always this window of opportunity where attackers would try and use exploits against systems before the system administrators have fully patched and remediated against their attack. And there's always systems that take a very long time to actually be remediated. So with vulnerability testing, it only tests what is actually known. So who can conduct the tests? In terms of actually conducting a penetration test, you can have internal testers that may be organized into sort of tiger teams or red teams, which is a term used for an internal people who act as attackers and will attack the network. They will be independent of the operators of the network, the system administrators, and they'll be tasked with actually testing for vulnerabilities and testing the security issues. So you can have internal testers, and obviously you can employ third-party external testers, ethical hackers, security researchers to actually conduct the tests. The testing needs to be done by knowledgeable testers, and they really ought to be independent of the systems under test. So the administrator of a network, the designer, developer of a web application are not the ideal people to actually conduct a test on those systems. You want people who are familiar with web applications and networks, are not the ones responsible for the actual design, and they won't make assumptions that potentially somebody who's involved with the administration would do. So in trying to find knowledgeable testers, there are accreditation schemes in the UK, CHECK, the government-based scheme, CREST, Tiger Team, which are commercial equivalents of the CREST scheme, of the check scheme, will all accredit testing companies and testers for their knowledge and methodology. And also, there will be controls around the way that they will actually conduct the test in terms of scoping, quality assurance, and safeguarding your data during the actual test itself. There are other organisations, accreditation schemes in other countries. There are sort of organisations such as the EC Council that offer global accreditation schemes. But in the UK, sort of Czech, the government-run one, and Crest and Tiger team are the most popular schemes for accreditation of penetration testers. And then there's also the issue of the qualifications, and again, Czech, Crest and Tiger team run their own qualifications for testers. They don't just accredit organisations, but the actual individual testers as well. There's also the EC Council through their Certified Ethical Hacker and other qualifications that will actually qualify a tester, and SANS run a number of penetration testing courses, and increasingly these days there are a number of bachelor science degrees or master science degrees in computer security and penetration testing, all of which indicates a level of knowledge of the actual tester themselves. So moving on from this sort of qualification accreditation of the testers, let's look at why you should actually do sort of testing. So there's regulatory compliance. So within the PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, there is a requirement for actually vulnerability scanning, so our level 1 testing, and also for full penetration testing, our level 2 testing. These can be conducted on a sort of quarterly basis for the level 1 or annual for the level 2, but it's part of the regulatory compliance environments. It also can show due diligence in protecting personal, identifiable information, intellectual property, or payment details, as well as giving sort of an assurance to senior management that the controls have been implemented by the networking team, the application developers, are actually effective, are working, and are protecting the assets of the organisation. So with the increasing complex software and website and networks, it is introducing more security holes. Increasingly, security researchers, both the reputable and non-reputable ones, are publishing information about these vulnerabilities they discover. And quite often, within hours of an announcement, an exploit will be made publicly available for people to actually exploit those vulnerabilities. So organisations are continually at risk from attacks through automated botnets, automated scanning tools that are looking at the attack surface area to see if there are vulnerabilities that could be exploited. And since any successful cyber intrusion will lead to significant remediation costs, as well as downtime and loss of productivity, along with reputational damage, compliance breach costs and legal actions, not testing could be quite a costly process to go down. So efficient and routine penetration testing systems is a way of establishing that networks and applications are generally secure against today's cyber attacks. Over the last few years, it's been reported that the number of vulnerabilities being discovered each week is increasing. And quite often these days, you don't know you've actually been breached until it's too late. Someone reports that their card details have been used elsewhere, or a customer phones up and says there's a malware on your website, or it's been defaced. So quite often, it's with an attack, you're not aware your defences have failed until it's too late. So testing your defences through regular penetration testing will ensure that you minimise the risk to your organisation. And then again, if you're doing business with the government, penetration testing is a requirement of the UK central government baseline security plans, and invitations to tender documents issued by the HMA government also reference penetration testing. And if you are sort of ISO 27001 certified, then again you need to do a risk assessment process where you can identify the risks through testing, penetration testing, and you need assurance that the controls you put in place are actually working. Again, this sort of penetration testing can help with the ISO 27001 compliance regime. So this leads on to when should you test? Testing all the time is impractical. It can be very costly. So you need to use a sort of a frequency of testing that's dependent on the risk of your organisation. If your organisation is dealing with high volumes of credit card details, or lots of private personal identifiable information or intellectual property, then you may need to actually do more frequent testing, as well as sort of a regular test. Changes after the deployment of new infrastructure or applications, changes to those is also recommended. So in terms of actually choosing a risk-based frequency interval, you need to consider sort of the cost of actually not testing, the cost of the sort of the value of protecting the data against the actual cost of actually conducting the test. And quite often the different levels of testing are more appropriate for certain scopes. So quite often the level 1 penetration test, which looks at the reporting the vulnerabilities, will be done against the whole infrastructure, whereas level 2, we're actually trying to actually breach, gain access to a particular system. That will be done against particular targets, high value, high risk targets that were identified as being vulnerable during the first level 1 test. So we're going to move on to actually talking about arranging a test. And organisations such as CREST actually have a booklet which can be available from any reputable penetration testing company that's actually been accredited by CREST. And this actually outlines for purchasers of pen testing what they should be looking for. So they talk about selecting a supplier, scoping the engagement, the reports, and support for the remediation activities. So in terms of selecting a supplier, you should be actually looking to see about their reputation, their history, ethics of the actual penetration company. Do they take, are they actually members of CREST or Tiger Team, or are they check approved? Do they take part in specialised industry events such as those run by CREST or OWASP? And are they able to demonstrate exploits and vulnerabilities they've found in other similar environments? And can they provide independent feedback on the quality of the work and conduct of staff? And do they adhere to a formal code of conduct overseen by an independent test body? So looking for an accredited penetration test company goes a long way to actually finding an ethical, knowledgeable penetration company. So the next stage of your find it is actually the scoping of your penetration test. And your provider should actually help you with the scoping exercise and ask you questions such as what is the business drivers behind the need of or the want to actually do a penetration test, what are you trying to actually gain from this testing, and the threats you're trying to protect from. So your penetration test provider should actually be asking you questions that will actually help them identify the type of testing that you need to meet your needs. And also you need to actually understand whether you're testing the infrastructure and applications, or are you testing controls such as the administrators or the monitoring systems that you have on your systems. So your penetration test partner should be asking you questions during the scoping process to enable you to actually correctly scope the actual test itself. In addition to actually selecting what devices, what addresses, what applications need testing, permission needs to be gained to actually conduct the test. And this actually also includes the third-party permissions. Lots of organisations these days have a virtual infrastructure that may be hosted in by a hosting provider, or could actually be within the cloud itself. And the test ought to be conducted on these systems, and then the hosting provider themselves also need to be involved in actually giving permission for the tests to be conducted. In terms of reporting, you should expect to have a technical report on the vulnerabilities, along with an executive summary that explains the vulnerabilities for senior management, without going into the technical details. It needs to actually be focused on your organisation's business risk needs, and should identify short-term tactical recommendations, and also do a root cause analysis on the vulnerabilities. As I've mentioned previously, quite often a single problem may be the cause of a number of apparent vulnerabilities, and fixing the roots will actually fix the vulnerabilities on a more permanent basis. And it should actually outline a security improvement action plan to actually make sure you don't only just remediate these, but also help your organisation maintain security in the future, and provide assistance to the organisations in implementing the security improvements and remediation actions identified. So, findings identified in the penetration test should be recorded in an agreed format, and should be both in sort of technical and non-technical terms, so that justifications for the corrective actions are understood. So it should include details about the vulnerabilities, evidence of what the vulnerabilities identified were, and the associated technical risks and the remediation measures that could be undertaken. So I've outlined what penetration testing is. I've outlined how organisations should be looking at the use of penetration testing to actually improve the security of their organisations. So I want to sort of sum it up in that the penetration testing provides a means of testing the information security controls. It can give an assurance that those controls are actually working. It will give an indication of the visibility of your organisation to potential attackers. The bigger the visible attack surface area, the more likely you are to be discovered by automated scanning tools and malicious bots designed to actually probe the whole of the internet address space looking for vulnerabilities. So the testing is required to provide assurance, but when you actually undertake the testing, careful scoping needs to be done. You need to select what is actually within scope of the test itself. Consideration of whether or not the test itself will actually affect the availability of your systems, especially if you're testing production systems. And permission is required from all parties when conducting testing. Quite often we've been asked to do testing, and when we've actually sort of looked into the background of the system to be tested, we've actually then found them to be hosted on the cloud service provider. And we've had to go back and actually then try and then ask for permission from the cloud service provider before we can actually start the testing. So gaining permission from all parties, not just the client or their service providers, is important. If permission is not given, then it turns from a penetration test for that party into an attack on that third party. So they must have agreed to actually enable the testing to go ahead. So I've covered a sort of background to the testing, sort of given a summary. In terms of sort of testing that can be done, there are IT health checks, web application security testing, network wireless, along with a range of sort of the PCI DSS tests that are required. So IT governance is more than capable of actually meeting your requirements for penetration testing. I'm more than happy to discuss what those requirements are. So if there's any questions, I will now try and actually answer them. I've been asked by one attendee whether the slides will be sent to the attendees, and yes, they will be sent along with a recording as well. And that will be done tomorrow. I've been asked about how regular is a regular pen test. Some of that can be actually decided by the compliance environment. For the PCI DSS, certain types of tests must be done quarterly, and a full penetration test must be done annually. But for other organizations, if there's a high risk to your assets, then you may want to sort of look at, say, sort of a quarterly basis, or 6 monthly or yearly. And a number of organizations that we have worked with will conduct internal testing as frequently as sort of monthly within inside their organization. I've also been asked about what OWASP is, which is the Open Web Application Security Project. This is a non-profit organization that offers a lot of advice on web application development, testing, and remediation activities for web applications. They have a big collection of resources, of guidelines and resources for testing. This is important as a lot of web application developers are not fully au fait with all the remediation techniques for vulnerabilities that can occur. So they give you the tools and the information that is required. I've been asked about how do you recommend testing in a QA or non-production versus production for pen testing. My recommendation sort of in the non-production environment is that especially for a lot of systems, security should have built into the requirements of the actual system. So in terms of procuring systems, design and developing systems, security should have been built in, and that as part of the actual acceptance testing, there should be an element of actual penetration testing and acceptance tests to make sure that all the typical problems with applications and systems have been resolved. I've also been asked about IT's governance penetration tests covering the Heartbleed vulnerability. We were able to offer that as part of our services, effectively sort of within 2 days of the actual public announcement, we were testing for Heartbleed vulnerabilities in systems. So yes, our penetration tests do cover that and have done since effectively it was reported. And also been asked about the PCI penetration tests, and yes, they should be done in the production environment, which is problematic because I have already said about the problems with potential dangerous testing causing stability issues with production environments. So that actually covers needs careful scoping between the testers and the actual organization requiring it to actually ensure that the tests, the risk from those tests is actually minimized. So doing it during quiet periods, downtime, maintenance periods, is a way forward. I'm just looking through the questions to see which ones I can cover off. I've been asked about how do you engage with a cloud provider regarding penetration testing. Most of the cloud providers that we've come across actually have means to actually have this requested. For example, with Amazon themselves, not seeing that in particular, but with them, they actually have on their website a form that a company can download, fill out, and actually request testing. And in my experience, Amazon have never refused permission for a penetration test to actually be done on a hosted environment. I've been asked, there's a number of questions sort of coming in. I've been asked about how can you use information for IDS, RPS to help with the scoping. Intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems will give alerts on what areas of the organization are being attacked. So you can actually use the information from those systems to identify targets that not only are likely but are actually already being probed, and therefore probably ought to be included within the scope to ensure that they are not a point of weakness. So I think I've covered the questions that have been coming up. If I have not answered your question, please do contact me and I will try and answer them after this meeting. I hope you found it useful and interesting, and thank you very much for attending.